To what lengths would you go to be healed? Right now, there is no cure for the coronavirus disease. Scientists all over the world are working on a vaccine which could prevent the virus from causing the disease, but that's not a cure. Now, right now we have ways of making it survivable for those who might otherwise not survive it, but those methods don't always work. And you still have to make it weeks before the virus runs its course through your body. That's not a cure either. The best thing we can do at the moment is to contain the spread of the virus, which is why we are doing what we're doing right now. It's been months already, and it isn't easy, but it is working. And I do not want to imagine what life would be like right now if we had continued on as normal, and if COVID were far more rampant than it is now. And yet already we are seeing acts of desperation. People are afraid, and they are angry, which is very dangerous when it is combined with the absence of hope. But right now we do have reasons to hope. Social distancing is working, and the daily statistics are improving. The coronavirus is not gone, and it is not going away, but we have a defense, even if it is a difficult one. We have hope. And that might be the most important defense we have right now. Over the last few weeks, we have been on a series called The Untouchables and the Unclean. We have been looking at stories of the outsiders and outcasts that Jesus encountered in his ministry. And perhaps in this time of quarantine and social distancing, we might be able to empathize with the people in these stories even more. And perhaps there is much that these stories can teach us even today. We have looked at the story of a leper that Jesus healed, and then last week, the story of a man possessed by a legion of demons. And we're actually going to pick up right where we left off last week, at the end of Luke chapter 8. At the end of this chapter, Jesus and his disciples had briefly been on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But now they returned back to the city of Capernaum, where they were before the whole situation with the storm on the lake and the legion incident. And Jesus had left to let the crowds calm down because they were overwhelming him. And earlier in the chapter, Jesus' mother and brothers couldn't make their way through the crowds to see him. Now, a couple of days had passed, maybe the situation was better, but as it turned out, the answer was no. And in fact, the crowds were sitting there waiting for Jesus to return. And the whole reason that they had been gathered in the first place was because Jesus had just gone on a spree of healing a whole lot of people, including Peter's mother-in-law. And seeing that Jesus was back, the crowd was excited that the miracle worker had returned. And they had a lot of miracles for him. In verse 41 we read that among the crowd was a man named Jairus. He was a man worthy of respect in Capernaum, for he was the leader of the synagogue, which was the Jewish house of prayer. Actually, in the previous chapter of Luke, we read that one of the people that Jesus had healed was the servant of the centurion that had built that synagogue for the people. And Jairus had a similar reason for coming to Jesus, but this was far more personal to him. His 12-year-old daughter was sick. His little girl, she was dying. And as you might imagine, Jairus was in an emotional state to the point where, finding Jesus, he falls at his feet and begs him and pleads him to heal his daughter. Now, this was not something a person of Jairus' social standing would normally do, but for Jairus, he was desperate. And he saw Jesus as the only hope for his daughter. And so Jesus went with him. But it was difficult because the crowds were so dense that they were threatening to crush and trample them. And in the midst of this narrative, Luke intertwines another story. And this layering is unusual and unique in the Gospels, except for Mark, who shares the story in a similar way. In this great crowd of people, there was a woman. And this woman was also sick. For 12 years, for as long as Jairus' daughter had been alive, she had been bleeding. The 12 years was coincidental, or perhaps it was not. For 12 years, she was bleeding and hemorrhaging continually, and doctors had no idea what to do. She had spent all of her money trying to find a cure, but no one could heal her. She too was desperate. Leviticus made it clear that she was unclean and impure. If she had been married, this was grounds for a divorce. She would have lost so much in her life and was about to lose all hope too. Then she heard about Jesus. Seeing the crowds around him, she gathered up her courage and she left her house and went to him. She pushed past the sea of people, touching them like she knew she was not supposed to do. And eventually she managed to get close enough to Jesus that she's able to reach out and to touch the edge of his cloak. And as she grasped the very edge of it, just enough to get her fingers on it, something happened. She was suddenly and instantly healed. And this caused something of a scene because Jesus' response was to stop what he was doing and ask the question, "Who touched me?" Now, everyone looked around and denied it. And Peter, who was excellent at stating the obvious, he mentioned to Jesus that, "Hey, there's a crowd of people around you, Master." And actually, a lot of people were touching him. But Jesus persisted. He wouldn't let this go. And in verse 46, we read, Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Now this can be a little confusing because it makes it seem that Jesus didn't know who had touched him and didn't know that he had just healed someone. But that is not the case. Nor is it the case that his cloak had magical healing powers. It's clear that the healing came from Jesus and not his clothes, and that he was completely aware of it. Instead, what Jesus was doing was intentionally asking a question to which he already knew the answer, because he wanted to draw attention to this woman for a reason. And this woman, knowing that she couldn't hide or sneak away, she fell at Jesus' feet like so many others had done, except she trembled in fear. Perhaps she was ashamed. Or maybe she was afraid that she had made a mistake and Jesus was about to punish her or scold her. Maybe people knew that she had been unclean and had touched them as she had pushed past them. In front of all of these people, she confessed what had happened and explained to them why she had done what she had did. But Jesus' response was not to condemn her. He commended her. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. He points her out not as a woman of guilt, but as a woman of faith. And it is this strong, bold faith that has healed her. This is why he asked that question. He didn't want such a powerful example of faith and persistence to go unnoticed. As the crowd took in what had just happened, and while Jesus is still speaking, Jairus received terrible news. Someone from his house had made their way to inform him that it was too late. She was dead. But the message given to him was blunt. The messenger had no heart of mercy. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Can you imagine Jairus? He only wanted to find some way to save his daughter, and here he did. He had found a man who could heal her. They were on their way to his house, stopping only for a moment to heal someone else. But that moment had been too long. Or maybe it wouldn't have mattered. She was gone. He didn't even get to be with her when she died. But before Jairus could fully absorb the shock of the news, Jesus moved to comfort him. And in verse 50, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." Jesus comforted him in his sorrow, urging him to not lose hope, because there was more power at work than Jairus may have been aware. They continued and arrived at Jairus' house, where the whole household was mourning and crying over the loss of this young girl. And leaving the crowd behind and taking only those closest to him, Jesus comforted the crowd, telling them that she was not dead. She was sleeping. And now this was a common metaphor for death back then, but it was clear to them that this couldn't be literally true. Now these people were not ignorant, and there was no mistaking that she had died. And they laugh and scoff at Jesus' suggestion. But in saying this, Jesus was giving them some form of hope that they could hold on to, that they could lean on in this distressing time. Because they needed to believe that Jesus could still save her. And their laughter stopped as they watched Jesus take the hand of the dead girl, which was also against Levitical law. But then he told her to get up. And at once she stood up. And at once she was a completely healthy young girl. And those who witnessed this once again were astonished. But for Jesus, this was simply one of the reasons why he came to earth. What we find in these two stories, as well as the preceding story of Legion and the other stories of healing lepers and beggars, is a theme that is found throughout the Gospels. It follows Jesus everywhere, not just in stories of healing, but in his teaching as well. What Jesus was doing was giving hope. And not just to the people of the world in a general sense, but Jesus was specifically giving hope to those who needed it the most. He was giving hope to the hopeless, to the outcasts, to the shunned. But most importantly, and what we see in all of these stories that we've seen in this series, is that Jesus was giving hope and healing to the unclean. All of them were cut off, separated, and alone. Their lives were ruined, and any dreams that they had were gone. All of them were without a future and without hope. These were people that were untouchables and unclean, but Jesus defied this over and over again, showing that he did not care. These were people that everyone avoided and had a right to avoid because that's what the law commanded them to do. But here is Jesus, the Son of God, breaking the very rules that God had laid out for them. Because for him there was no barrier that was too great, because he was bridging all of them, proving that what God desires is mercy, not sacrifice. Mercy is what Jesus offers us, and because of mercy, we have hope. It is what the world needed then, and it is what the world needs now. As followers of Jesus, we must be people of mercy and hope. Not just receivers, but givers. Who is it in our world that needs mercy and hope right now? Who are the untouchables, the outcasts, the desperate, the hopeless? Let us not simply pray that they may find it, but let us pray that we find them and demonstrate to them God's mercy. That which we freely receive from God, we freely give. And by these holy things, we have faith. And faith is demonstrated in persistence. And that is what we will do together. By the power of Christ's Spirit, which was within us, we will persist, we will endure, and we will continue unto the end. May God be with you all.